Welcome back to your newest obsession, the NeuroSpicy MomPod. I'm your host, Austin Marie, Scorpio Stallion, recovering teacher, neurodivergent mom of two amazing kids, psychology nerd, and your mystical mom friend who believes you deserve a cozy corner of the internet where you don't have to mask or explain yourself. This is the safe landing spot for all of us who are deconstructing, unmasking, and figuring out how to raise our spicy kiddos while also reparenting ourselves along the way. And today we're going on a journey. Not just any journey, but a time-traveling one. We're going to zoom way back into history and ask, how did we even get here? How did humans go from seeing the quirky dreamer as touched by the divine to locking people away in asylums to now? Because here's the thing. When the world feels scary for neurodivergence, and it is scary right now, it helps to zoom out, to remember that we've always been here, so we're not going anywhere. So buckle in, grab your cozy drink, and let's step into the timeline together. Thousands of years ago, people didn't have the words autism or ADHD, but they still described the traits. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates wrote about what he called the sacred disease. He meant epilepsy, but the way he described it shows how people were trying to make sense of differences in behavior and brain function. They saw it as mysterious, sometimes divine, sometimes frightening. Plato even described divine madness. He broke it into categories. To him, being outside of the norm wasn't always a curse. Sometimes it was a gift. And if we look at all the gods themselves, well, some of them look pretty neurospicy to me. Dionysus, for example, god of wine and ecstasy, is intense, sensory-driven, full of joy one moment and wild chaos the next. If you've ever gone from a calm morning to total sensory overwhelm by dinner time, you know that energy. Then there's Ate, the goddess of folly and reckless impulse. She was blamed for clouding people's minds, making them act without foresight. Doesn't that sound like the ancient Greeks invented a scapegoat for impulsivity or executive dysfunction? Even in philosophy, Theophrastus wrote about the obtuse man, a character who was distractible, forgetful, inattentive. And in folklore, every culture has a story of the odd child, the one who preferred animals to people, the dreamer who memorized entire histories but couldn't plow the field, the outsider who saw the world differently. That makes me think of my own kids. They can take a single concept and turn it over in their mind from so many angles it blows me away. They'll ask questions that make me think, how did your brain even go there? That's the same brilliance that's always existed. Back then, it was woven into myth or magic. Today, we call it neurodivergence. So right from the start, let's anchor this. We've always been here. The Industrial Revolution has transformed life. For the first time, towns and cities are swelling with factories. Workers are expected to follow the clock, produce efficiently, and fit into a system designed for order and productivity. So what happens if you can't? If you're restless, impulsive, too sensitive to noise, too dreamy, or you just don't fit, you weren't just inconvenient. You were seen as a problem that needed to be removed from society. This is where asylums step into the stage. The very first institutions were not the grand hospitals we picture from reformer brochures. They were grim, prison-like places. Many were converted monasteries, workhouses, or almshouses. Imagine dark stone walls, barred windows, locked doors, people chained to walls or floors, kept in cells that smelled of filth. Inmates slept on straw or bare boards, often without heat in winter. And the people inside weren't only those we now call psychiatric patients, autistic children who couldn't be controlled at home, people with epilepsy who were feared as dangerous or possessed, individuals with physical disabilities who couldn't work in factories, women who were labeled hysterical or simply disobedient, the elderly, the poor, the unwanted. They were all lumped together in these bleak environments. Conditions were brutal, food was meager and often spoiled, hygiene was non existent. Punishments, whippings, chains, ice baths was common. Many people died inside, and yet the public didn't see this. Towns built their asylums on the edges of the cities, out of sight, out of mind. Families might drop off a relative and never visit again. Once you entered, there was little chance of leaving. Only later, as the 1700s closed and the 1800s began, reformers like Dorothea Dix lobbied state legislators to fund new purpose-built asylums. That's when we get the grand Kirkbride Plain hospitals, huge symmetrical buildings with domed centers and long wings designed to bring in light and air. The architecture itself was part of the sales pitch. Gardens, farmland, workshops, a self-sustaining community that promised healing. But here's the chilling truth. Asylums quickly became overcrowded warehouses anyway. A building meant for 250 patients could hold 1,000 within a decade. Staff were stretched thin, and treatment gave way to control. And the people inside, many of them neurodivergent by today's standards, were still stripped of autonomy and hidden away from public life. As the calendar turned into the 1900s, asylums were everywhere. Every state in the U.S. had at least one. In Europe, they sprawled across the countryside. These weren't little community retreats anymore. They were enormous fortress-like institutions, housing thousands of people. And the philosophy began to shift. Reformers had promised rest, routine, and moral guidance. But now psychiatry was becoming a medical profession. Doctors wanted to prove they had real science and real cures. Families exhausted from caring for relatives at home wanted hope. Politicians wanted to show progress. So the asylum rebranded itself as the hospital. The buildings still look grand on the outside. Sweeping lawns, pillared entrances, gardens for patients to recover in. Families saw postcards of red brick buildings with the names like State Hospital for the Insane and thought, this is modern. This is scientific. This will help my child, my spouse, my parent. But inside, the story was very different. By the early 1900s, overcrowding was already rampant. A ward designed for 50 might hold 200. Beds crammed together, patients sleeping in corridors, the air thick with the smell of sweat, urine, and disinfect. Staff, overwhelmed and underpaid, relied on control instead of care. And then came the so-called treatments. Doctors experimented endlessly, searching for a cure that didn't exist. One common practice was hydrotherapy, strapping patients into cold baths for hours or even days at a time, under the belief that icy water could calm the brain and wash away agitation. By the 1930s, electroconvulsion therapy, what we called ECT, arrived. In those early years, it was done without anesthesia or muscle relaxants. Patients convulsed so violently that bones broke and teeth shattered. And yet, newspapers ran stories calling it a miracle that could bring patients back from madness. Another so-called cure was insulin shock therapy. Doctors injected people with massive doses of insulin until their blood sugar plummeted and they slipped into a coma. The idea was that this would reset the brain. In reality, it was dangerous and often deadly. And then came the most infamous of them all, the lobotomy. By the 1940s, this procedure was celebrated as the crown jewel of psychiatry. Surgeons, most famously Walter Freeman, traveled the country performing them, often with little more than an ice pick slipped behind the eye socket to sever brain connections. He called it quick, clean, effective. Families were told it would calm their loved ones, make them easier to manage. But the reality was devastating. By the time the practice finally faded in the 1950s, tens of thousands of people, many of them women, children, and people we would now recognize as neurodivergent, had been lobotomized. One of the most famous cases was Rosemary Kennedy. sister of President John F. Kennedy. At just 23 years old, she was subjected to a lobotomy because her family had been told it would calm her moods and make her more manageable. Instead, it left her permanently disabled, with the mental capacity of a young child, and she spent the rest of her life hidden away in institutions. Her story shows how these treatments didn't just affect people society already wanted to forget. They reached into the most powerful families in America. And here's the chilling full circle moment. Today, Rosemary's nephew, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is on the political stage suggesting that neurodivergent people, and even people taking antidepressants, should be put back onto farms, as though forced labor in a pastoral setting is somehow a cure. He frames it as compassion. But if you know this history, it's impossible not to see the echo. The same family that permanently silenced a young woman through a barbaric procedure is now floating new versions of the same old idea, that people who think and feel differently are problems to be managed, not humans deserving of dignity and autonomy. And that's the thing. This wasn't just about one family or one era. Newspapers ran glowing headlines about miracle cures. Hospital administrators posed in white coats for photographs, while inside patients were restrained, medicated, shocked, or cut open. Politicians cut ribbons on new hospital wings, promising voters that science would solve the problem of madness. Families clung to the hope that their loved ones might come home cured. Most never did, because behind those walls, lives were erased. Neurodivergent children who couldn't sit still, autistic adults who couldn't mask enough to pass, women struggling with postpartum depression, men who couldn't conform to factory schedules. All of them were swept up, experimented on, and silenced. And the message society absorbed was clear. Difference was a disease, and disease had to be controlled. Once again, the public thought they were seeing compassion. They thought they were seeing science, but really society was still doing the same thing it always had, hiding away people who didn't fit and selling it back to the public as progress. This is where hope finally breaks through. In the 60s and 70s, parents, many of them mothers, said, "No, we're not hiding our kids anymore. They deserve schools, services, dignity." They fought hard, and in 1975, we got the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. That law is why kids today have IEPs. At the same time, the larger disability rights movement was rising. Activists said, "Nothing about us without us." This gave us ramps, accessible buses, the ADA. It gave us the idea that disabled and neurodivergent people have rights, not just needs. And in some ways, this echoed back to the old traditions of holy fools or natural fools at court, people whose differences once gave them unique roles in society, even if precarious. Now, instead of roles of mockery, people were demanding recognition, inclusion, and equality. As a teacher, I lived inside this legacy. Every IEP meeting I sat in was a direct descendant of this movement. Every kid who got a chance to learn in my classroom instead of being shut out, that's because people fought back in this era. And then comes Judy Singer, an autistic sociologist in the 1990s. She gave us the word neurodiversity. One word, but it shifted everything. Instead of disorder, it became diversity. Instead of broken, it became different. The internet made this explode. Suddenly, autistic adults who had been isolated in their own towns could find each other. ADHD adults could say, "Wait, you lose track of time too? So do I." Online communities became a lifeline, and from them grew language, pride, and self-advocacy. And now, TikTok, Instagram, podcasts like this one. We're in the age of unmasking. People are standing up and saying, "I'm autistic, I'm ADHD, I'm dyslexic, I'm AUDHD, and I don't need fixing. I need acceptance, honesty. I need acceptance." Honestly, I think of myself here. For years, I thought I was just failing. I was the teacher who was too sensitive, the mom who couldn't get it together. And then I realized it's not that I'm broken. I'm just wired differently. That moment of reframing changed everything. And that brings us here today, where neurodivergence is more visible than ever, and yet under attack. Supports are being cut, accommodations politicized. Parents are scared, adults are scared. I'm scared. But when I look at this history, I see progress. We've gone from being locked away to being pathologized to building communities to celebrating our differences on global platforms, from whispered shame to pride. And that's the grounding reminder I want you to carry. Neurodivergent people have always existed. We are not new. We are not broken. And we are not going anywhere. You listening right now, you're part of that history. You're carrying the torch forward. And before we sign off, I want to get a little practical and a little cozy because history matters, yes, but so does the right now care and community. If any of this episode landed heavy for you, remember, you don't have to carry it alone. I created a safe retreat for the NeuroSpicy community over on my Patreon. It's not just bonus episodes, it's conversation boards where we check in on each other. We can swap survive and thrive hacks, trade sensory-friendly product tips, vent about IEP meetings, and celebrate the tiny victories that rarely make the highlight reel. It's a softer space than social media, and it's there for you if you need a real community. Also, and this is me being delightfully optimistic, I'm starting a book club. When my ADHD finally lets me lock in dates, we'll pick short, cozy reads and meet once a month and talk about the ideas, the feelings, and the real-life applications. No pressure, no grades, no required reading speed, just us, some cozy drinks, and a little structure to help build connection. If you want in, Patreon is the easiest way to join the queue and get the calendar invites when I actually get my act together. Now for folks who want immediate practical supports. There are a lot of options out there, and they don't all look like the things we saw in the past. For kids, school-based supports like IEPs or 504 plans can change daily life. Extra time, sensory breaks, or classroom accommodations can be game changers. For adults, workplace accommodations under ADA might look like flexible schedules, noise-reducing headphones, or written instruction instead of long verbal ones. Clinical supports can include occupational therapy for sensory needs, speech therapy for communication, or coaching and therapy approaches for executive function and emotional regulation. Medication is an option for some and can be life-changing for others, but that's always a personal medical conversation. And don't underestimate peer support. Whether it's local support groups, online communities, or moderated spaces like my Patreon boards, where people are learning from each other in real time. Tech helps too. Visual timers, apps for task chunking, noise-canceling headphones, even simple checklists, small things add up. If you're not sure where to start, try connecting with your community, talking with your child's teacher or HR rep about accommodations, or finding a clinician who listens instead of dismisses. And if that feels overwhelming, I'm working on putting together a gentle resource list, a non-overwhelming one with starting points for advocacy, therapy, coaching, and peer support, and I'll drop it on Patreon when it's ready. Because this work, getting support, building community, learning the history, it's all part of the same project, keeping each other safe, seen, and cared for. And you don't have to do it alone. So when things feel heavy, remember, you're not alone. You're not broken. You are part of a long, complicated, beautiful history of humans who think and feel differently. If you love this deep dive, please make sure you're subscribed, share this episode with a friend who needs it, and if you want to support your mystical mom friend over here, check out my Patreon where I share behind-the-scenes magic, community conversation boards, and soon our book club. You deserve rest, you deserve joy, and your brain deserves to be celebrated. Until next time, my friends, stay spicy. Ta-ta!